This talk is about accessibility in the Dazn system and easy wins and lessons learned. This is a table of content. You can see kind of like the topics we're going to cover. If you check the QR code, you can access the slides. They are on my GitHub. If you want to check them right now in the live stream or later. Yeah, let's start. As I said, hi everyone. My name is Riccardo Erra. I'm a senior front-end engineer from Rome, Italy. I've been living in London for the last 13 or 14 years. I've been working on and around the Dazn system for quite a long time. I used to work for Acne Council and I started like a pattern library there. My previous role was at Bulb, the energy company. I used to maintain the Dazn system with some other front-end engineers. Currently, I work at Mews. Mews is a management system for hotels and properties as well as their guests. The company started in 2012. It's based in Prague. We just had a Series C investment last month. Quite big company. There's like 650 employees more or less, and 180 are in the kind of like technical department. So before actually talking about the easy wins and the lesser learned, I want to give you like a very quick introduction about accessibility, or usually shortened as A11Y or LI. So I really like this. This is a quote. Everything that's not like my kind of like thinking, it's referenced at the end in the resources. So I'm not stealing stuff from other people. So I'm reading this. Accessibility is the practice of making your website usable by as many people as possible. And I picked this quote because I like how inclusive it is. It's not talking about disability or any sort of like impediment or stuff like that. It just talks about like people. So talking about like all of us, we're all people. There's not just like us and them. It's quite inclusive. I think it's quite important to use the right language when we're talking about accessibility. Something else about accessibility, it's quite important to keep in mind, is that we think that the people that have accessibility needs are very like a small percentage of the kind of like the people in general, but it actually is not the case. As you can see from this slide, 1 billion people currently experience some form of disability. We are like, what, 7-8 billion in the world? So, you can do the percentage yourself. And the reason why it's, if you check like this illustration on the right, this is actually coming from Microsoft. It shows like quite well how we should reframe the concept of accessibility and people that have accessibility. It's not just like permanent accessibility needs, but also like, temporary, situational. Each of us in any moment, we can be in a situation where for some reason, let's say we are, there's the one on the top right. Let's say we're holding a baby and we're using our computer. We cannot use the mouse. We cannot use the keyboard. They can create a situation where, let's say, if the website you're accessing doesn't work with the keyboard navigation, at the moment you can access the website and the service. Also, I guess if you don't care about people and you care about money, there's also like a good start. Businesses lose approximately £2 billion every month by ignoring the needs of disabled people. So I guess you can use this slide with your boss if he doesn't care about people. I don't know, up to you. Let's talk about like the easy wins first. And I guess a bit of backstory. So I joined Mews in 2021, and last year the team was like, we have actually a proper design system team. It's like up to 10 people now. Last year we were like kind of like less people, 2 or 3 of us. So at some point we were without a designer for a few months, and we decided to kind of spend our time improving the components that we already had. And we decided to tackle accessibility, and we realized quite quickly that our components were not very accessible at all. And that's why we spent 6 months just trying to fix as many components as possible and as much as possible. And those are kind of like the easy wins, meaning like the things that we managed to fix and improve with not much effort, and we gain quite a lot in terms of accessibility. First of all, why accessibility in the design system is quite important. Again, I'm going to read this quote. The design system presents a unique opportunity to build accessibility and inclusion into your component library from the get-go. If you think about it, like when you build like a button and then has to be rebuilt every time, like from scratch, you have to hope that developer who's building that button at the moment actually knows and time and cares about accessibility. But then if your button comes from your design system and was made accessible in the first place, every time the component gets reused and consumed by the other developers in your products, it will stay accessible all the time. And this is why we should focus on accessibility a lot in our design system in order to then spread this accessibility in all our products and platform where the components are consumed. The first easy win that we kind of faced and we decided to go for was to start with colors. Colors are a massive part of the design system. Even when you have a very basic design system, usually the colors are always there. Sometimes they're kind of the first thing that you do. And you can just start with the colors. You can use I put the screenshot here on the right. This is the WebAIM color contrast checker. You can just, compare manually the foreground and the background colors on all the different situations that you have, all the different buttons and elements and backgrounds. And you can gather from the score, from the ratio, if actually it's good enough or not, and if you're in a situation where your colors are not accessible. Or, you can go more complicated. This is something taken from Stripe. They build this very, very complex color palette automated tool that's based on the color spaces. It's quite mind-blowing. Automatically can pick the right colors and the right shade and palette for you. Either is good. I guess start with a simple one, and if you realize you have a lot of colors and it's more complicated and you want to build something that's maintainable, then build a tool for yourself. Another easy win, and something that I think we're aware of, but we kind of forget, especially in this day and age, that we have all this very great, but kind of overcomplicated sometimes, JavaScript framework. It's that you should try to use semantic code and build your components in the most semantic way as possible. This is because the web was built in a way with HTML, and the browsers know how to kind of interpret the HTML element, how to make them accessible, how to work with them. So if you end up using the right components, the right HTML element at the right time, you end up already with a lot of accessibility out of the box. And obviously you can achieve the same, not using semantic code, but it's all extra work. And I guess you're building something less robust at the end. And obviously, sometimes it's not possible to use semantic HTML, and that's correct, that's right. Just try to use semantic HTML as much as possible. I kind of made this very, very simple example, just I guess to show the point. On top we have a button written without using semantic code, and at the bottom is the same element just using semantic code. And as you can see, first we're using less code, as you can see from the bottom example, and also we don't have to think about all the different stuff that we had to add manually if, for example, using a div element instead of a bottom element. Something else that we kind of was easy in a way for us to understand what we have to do and achieve a better accessibility in general was to start to test with keyboard and ensure that all your content is accessible by keyboard alone. This is something anyone can do. Throw your mouse away, just try to use your keyboard. Try to navigate throughout your component. Try to use every single bits in your component. Try to see if you can enter an input label. You can click on a button and so on and so forth. This will actually help you to understand the kind of average accessibility of your component. And going back to the point I was making before, if you have semantic components and using semantic code, probably the keyboard navigation is going to work way better than if you end up with something that is not semantic. The last kind of easy win for us was to try to use screen readers and try to actually use our components just with screen readers. And then again, this quote, I quite like it, again, inclusive language. Screen readers enable the independent use of digital devices by those who otherwise would not be able. Again, he's talking about every kind of people in every type of moment. Sometimes we think about screen readers mainly for users that are visually impaired, but it's not just the case. A lot of people just prefer to use screen readers for certain scenarios and for certain products. That could be probably out of the kind of 4 easy wins, the more time-consuming one in a way. If you're not familiar with screen readers, there's multiple of them. They work for different operative systems. It's not sometimes that simple to understand what you have to do and how to use them. Probably will take a bit of time, but again, you can gain quite a lot in terms of accessibility for your component. I spoke about easy wins, and also, it's the title of my talk, also about lesson learned. And what I mean with that, think about, you have a coin, is always 2 sides. There's there's the lucky side and maybe the unlucky sides. So with lesson learned, I want to cover the kind of stuff that we understood maybe a bit too late while we were really like working on this long process, and kind of like we wish we kind of like knew sooner, and to make our life easier and to avoid maybe being slowed down, or maybe like being sure that everything was accessible and then you test your components and you realize you're not actually there yet. I want to start from this one that's about learning about standards, guidelines, and requirements. When we started, we're just like doing the easy ones I show you, test the colors, keyboard navigation, screen readers, use semantic code, but we were not aware about the different like standards and what actually are the requirements for those standards and the guidelines that can actually help you to understand. So, for example, this is a very useful like tool. This is a screenshot from the gov.uk website where there's a page that actually explains to you how to understand the WCAG like guidelines. So WCAG stands for Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, and we at Mews actually were aiming for the 2.1 WCAG standard. So that's kind of like the most used at the moment. So this page will help you to kind of like going through all the different guidelines are there. If you can read the document, but it's quite long and not very fun to read, to be honest. Another like tool that can help you, it's like you have to understand like that we didn't know at the beginning, like what are the requirements for being sure that actually you're achieving like this level. And there are tools like this one. This is built by IBM Accessibility. IBM, they have a great design system called Carbon. It's a very, very good one. And also they have this kind of like, it's like a tool that helps you to understand your requirements. As you can see from the screenshot, maybe it's small enough, maybe. So you can pick like the kind of like technology that you have and the standards that you're going to and the level, and then you have these kind of like checkboxes, and you can see actually what kind of things you should test against. And this example says, you have like 34 things, that you have to check. This can help you quite a lot while you're testing. You don't have just to do the things, classic things that we did, the color and the other stuff, but actually you know exactly what you check. Maybe you have to check the text zoom, low contrast ratio, and other stuff that you might not think about it. Maybe, audio, if you're like, let's say your website has some audio, you have to test against that, all this kind of stuff that maybe don't come to your mind in the first place, but they're quite important and you will need them to achieve like the standard. Something else that we wish we learned like sooner was like to never stop improving your testing skills. Like we knew how to test with keyboard, screen readers and other stuff, but then there were like so many things that we would do manually, and we have to remember to test this kind of stuff that we kind of like not try to use like tools because we're thinking the tools were not being help us, but actually they do quite a lot. This one is the one that we use quite a lot. This from Axie DevTools by Deck. This specifically can work as a browser extension, and you can just check in any page, it tells you like the score and tells you like kind of like what are the issues and what stuff you should focus on. There's others. This is from Microsoft. It's called Accessibility Insights. We use this at Mews for actually testing all our components. We find it like very good. This work as an app on web and mobile and on different OSs, Mac OS and Windows. Also as a browser extension, we use it as a browser extension and give you like a list of checkboxes you can check against manually, but also can do some like automated quick testing that can help you to gather more or less like the situation of your component and of your page. Quick disclaimer, I'm going to talk more about like code and tech stack and stuff like that. Those are the kind of like tools that we use and use for our design system. So maybe using something else, so maybe using different tech stacks. So your mileage may vary in terms of like how useful these things are, but it's only like 3 slides, so I think it's okay. And it's mainly like code and stuff, but I'll try to explain like as much as possible. This something like was very, very incredibly important for us to take advantage of the available tools. Like there's, you're not reinventing the wheel, you're trying to build something that is accessible and is robust and resilient, and there are tools out there that can help you to avoid mistake in the first place and also to repeat mistakes once you change some code and stuff. For example, this is a screenshot from a very, very cool ESLint tool that is called JSX Accessibility, and this tool actually you can have inside your IDE. This screenshot is in VS Code, and it shows you when you're writing some code, what are the accessibility issue in the specific component. So, they can help you quite a lot to try to avoid to build something that's kind of like broken from the beginning. You can even configure this tool in a way that you're not allowed to push any new code unless this actually is kind of like not correct, and is very, very useful. Another tool, like, we use Storybook for kind of like showing our components, and Storybook has a bunch of add-ons. One of the coolest one is there's an accessibility one that you can just add simply, and it just lives there in your Storybook. And for each component can actually show you what are the accessibility issues that component has. And it works pretty well. You can even, like, if there's multiple ones, there's a checkbox next to each of them, and you can select which one you want to check, and it's going to highlight the part of the component that actually is breaking the accessibility. Let's say your component is massive and it says like, oh, color contrast is not good enough, like where, like which bit of that component. So this is pretty good. And since we started to use this component, all components that were done, this add-on, all components that were done back in the days, like, was so easy to spot them, which ones that were still not accessible. And the kind of like another one that's about code, it's, I call it like use the force, like provide the right data or you'll get yelled at by your computer. There's, we at Mews, our components are built with React and TypeScript, and there's a way you can kind of like avoid that other people that are consuming your components end up doing something wrong or forget something. Because, when you have a design system, you have two sets of users, like the users, they use actually the product of the company that you work for, but also you have the other developers who are the people that consume your components and then build like application using your components. Those also are your users. And you have to build also like a DX, like developer experience for them in order to be able to use their components in a good way, but also like be able to not make mistakes. So you can do something like, React, you can add prop types to React, and what it does kind of like enforces some properties to be added to each component. For example, this is an image, and the alt tag, it's quite important for accessibility, that becomes like mandatory, is required. If the developer forgets to add it, then the component will throw some error and you cannot go on and you cannot commit your code. Or, we at Mews, we use TypeScript. There's another example. You have some props, you have an interface, and the alt tag, again, it's required. It means it has to be passed in order for the component actually to be valid and not actually have some error in your IDE. One of the last one, that's something like, he kind of like shocked me in a way, because maybe I was being a bit naive, like having accessible component or components, think about like a bunch of components all together combined in a page, is not the same as having an accessible page. Because you might test your components in isolation, they work amazingly well, but then when you combine together in a page, maybe you can navigate through one component, but somehow you cannot exit the component, you cannot navigate using the keyboard through the second component, all this kind of stuff. Or maybe like one component, when you zoom in, is hiding the one below or above. Like, those things are very, very important. So once we've done testing our components, what we did, we actually check all the pages where our components were used, and we tested them all together, and we found out something that we didn't find out while we were testing the components in isolation. And the last kind of like lesson learned, this is something I guess we still have to learn in Mews because we haven't done this yet. It's don't forget to commission a proper professional audit. What I mean with this, like, you can test as much as you want internally, everything, spend hours, days, weeks, months, but you are always like try to test your components without probably the skill and the knowledge or how a person with a disability was going to use like your product. So I have a professional audit, people that actually know how those tools, the screen reader or the keyboard navigation, it's used by actually the people in need and the people that will use your product in that way. Almost to the end, I think I'm just on time. So I want to like close with kind of like a couple of things. The first is the work is never done, but a bit of effort is better than no effort at all. What do I mean with this? Like, can be intimidating to find out that your components are, I don't know, 10% accessible, and you think, oh God, I don't have the time or the knowledge to actually get to 100. Like, don't think about that. It's kind of like a, half empty, half full glass situation. Like, let's say you spend 2 weeks and you increase your components from 10% to 20% in terms of accessibility. You're still far from 100, but you doubled the accessibility of your component. Like, think about like the small wins and kind of like drive those like wins to actually push you forward. And it's an effort that will continue forever. Don't think about that you will never achieve 100. Like, it's all about the small steps, because like, your most powerful weapon is empathy. You might not know how to do something. You might have to study, have to learn. You might find frustrating to use a screen reader, for example, but empathy is the most important thing that there is, like, to increase the accessibility of your component and to be sure that, like, everyone using your component and the products that get built, the components actually get a better experience. And I really hope that, after this talk, maybe you will go into your Dazn system and maybe you will try to fix maybe, the stuff here and there, just to make a small change that actually will make like a big impact for a lot of people. And yeah, that's it. Thank you. By the way, last thing, I should have been this before. We are hiring a Mews in my team. So if you're looking for a job, we're looking for a senior product manager. The QR code actually sends you to the application if you're interested. And yeah, thank you so much. The resources are at the end if you want to check. Everything that I quoted is there. Thank you.